In the early months of 1962, at the height of Cold War confrontation in the Western Hemisphere, a classified memorandum moved through the highest levels of the United States national security establishment, outlining proposals that, if executed, would have deliberately manufactured acts of violence against American targets and attributed them to the government of Fidel Castro, creating a pretext for open military intervention against Cuba. The document, formally titled Justification for U.S. Military Intervention in Cuba, was produced within the Department of Defense and presented to Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara in March 1962 after being approved by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and its contents reflected the intensity of strategic pressure felt in Washington following the failed Bay of Pigs invasion in April 1961. The consolidation of Castro's rule and growing intelligence assessments that Soviet influence in Havana was deepening. By early 1962, Cuba had transformed from a peripheral Caribbean state into what U.S. planners considered a forward operating base for communist expansion only 90 miles from Florida. And the Kennedy administration faced mounting criticism for the failed covert invasion carried out by CIA-trained Cuban exiles. Within this environment, contingency planning for a second, more direct intervention intensified under the broader umbrella of Operation Mongoose, a coordinated program of covert sabotage, psychological warfare, and political destabilization directed against the Castro regime. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, led by Chairman General Lyman Lemnitzer, operated within a strategic framework that prioritized credibility, deterrence, and the perceived necessity of preventing Soviet consolidation in the Western Hemisphere. And internal memoranda from this period reveal an institutional mindset focused on generating actionable justifications that would withstand domestic and international scrutiny in the event that overt military force became necessary. The March 13, 1962, Northwoods memorandum outlined a series of proposed scenarios designed to create what the document described as helpful wave of national indignation, including orchestrated incidents in U.S. cities, the sinking of refugee boats, simulated or real sabotage operations at Guantanamo Bay, and even the staging of an attack against a civilian aircraft. The language was procedural and administrative, framed not as speculative fiction, but as operational planning, complete with references to logistics, casualty lists, and coordination requirements. One proposal suggested developing a campaign of terror in Miami and other Florida cities, involving the use of fabricated evidence to implicate Cuban agents, while another described the possible blowing up of a U.S. ship in Cuban waters and conducting funerals for mock victims, deliberately invoking historical precedent by referencing the USS Maine explosion of 1898 as a potential analog. The AE memorandum also discussed the possibility of substituting an unmanned aircraft for a civilian airliner, creating a scenario in which the aircraft would be destroyed and attributed to hostile action, thereby generating public outrage without the loss of American lives, though the document acknowledged that actual casualties might further intensify political effect. These proposals were embedded in the bureaucratic language of defense planning, presented as options within a strategic toolkit rather than moral debates, reflecting a Cold War decision-making environment in which deception, covert action, and psychological operations were considered legitimate instruments of statecraft so long as they advanced national security objectives. The approval of the memorandum by the Joint Chiefs did not constitute authorization for execution, but it did indicate institutional endorsement at the highest uniformed military level, a fact that underscores the seriousness with which these contingencies were evaluated. The document was transmitted to Secretary McNamara, and from there to President John F. Kennedy, who had ultimate authority over any such operation. Kennedy's presidency in early 1962 was shaped by acute sensitivity to credibility after the Bay of Pigs, yet also by caution regarding escalation, particularly given the nuclear dimension of U.S.-Soviet rivalry. Intelligence reporting throughout 1961 and early 1962 suggested increasing Soviet military shipments to Cuba, though the full deployment of nuclear missiles would not be discovered until October of that year. Within this volatile context, Northwoods represented a bureaucratic effort to reconcile strategic objectives with the political constraints of overt aggression, attempting to engineer circumstances that would legitimize intervention under international law by framing it as defensive response. Kennedy ultimately rejected the proposals, and there is no evidence that he authorized any of the staged incidents outlined in the memorandum. General Lemnitzer's term as chairman of the Joint Chiefs concluded later in 1962, and while his departure cannot be attributed solely to Northwoods, the episode illustrates tensions between civilian leadership and military planners during the Cold War. The existence of the Northwoods Memorandum remained classified for decades until its declassification in the 1990s as part of broader document releases related to the assassination of President Kennedy, and its contents have since been cited as evidence of the breadth of contingency planning considered during moments of strategic anxiety. To understand Northwoods fully, it must be situated within the institutional culture of Cold War planning, where war games, contingency drafts, and deception scenarios were standard elements of operational readiness. Similar planning exercises existed for Europe, Asia, and the nuclear balance itself, often exploring extreme possibilities to prepare for worst-case contingencies. The memorandum's proposals drew upon established doctrines of psychological operations, including false flag techniques historically used in covert environments, and reflected the belief among some planners that domestic opinion could be mobilized through controlled incidents that shaped public perception. The document also reveals the bureaucratic layering of decision-making, in which proposals were drafted at staff levels, reviewed within the Pentagon hierarchy, and forwarded upward without necessarily reflecting consensus across the entire national security apparatus. While the Joint Chiefs endorsed the document, there is no evidence that the Department of State or other civilian agencies participated in drafting its scenarios. At the operational level, implementing even the less extreme proposals would have required interagency coordination involving the Department of Defense, elements of the CIA, and potentially the Federal Bureau of Investigation, raising complex issues of secrecy, compartmentalization, and information control. Maintaining plausible deniability would have required strict need-to-know protocols and carefully fabricated evidence streams. The emphasis on Guantanamo Bay within the memorandum is particularly significant, as the U.S. naval base in Cuba represented both a symbolic and strategic foothold, and staging incidents there would have provided a geographically proximate and politically resonant flashpoint. Northwoods thus stands as a document reflecting a moment when Cold War urgency intersected with institutional willingness to consider extraordinary measures. Yet, it also demonstrates the limits of that willingness when confronted with presidential authority. Kennedy's rejection indicates that while the national security bureaucracy could generate aggressive proposals, final decisions remained contingent upon civilian leadership. The episode illuminates the mechanics of Cold War crisis planning behind closed doors, where scenarios were drafted not for public consumption, but for strategic leverage, and where the boundary between defensive preparation and offensive manipulation could blur under pressure. Understanding Northwoods requires examining the broader strategic environment of early 1962, including Operation Mongoose's sabotage operations, CIA infiltration attempts, and ongoing exile paramilitary training, all of which contributed to a climate in which planners sought decisive options. Yet even within that environment, the deliberate staging of attacks on U.S. targets represented an escalation that crossed from covert destabilization into domestic manipulation. The Northwoods Memorandum therefore reveals less about executed policy and more about the spectrum of considered actions within Cold War planning culture, offering insight into how institutions grappled with the perceived necessity of regime change in Cuba while confronting legal, political, and strategic constraints imposed by nuclear deterrence and international scrutiny. By analyzing the document itself, its bureaucratic path, and the presidential response, one gains a clearer picture of the internal debates that shaped American decision-making at a time when the balance between provocation and restraint carried global consequences, and as 1962 progressed toward the Cuban Missile Crisis, the stakes of such planning would only intensify, placing the United States and the Soviet Union on the brink of confrontation in ways that dwarfed even the most aggressive contingencies outlined in March of that year. As the Northwoods Memorandum moved upward through the Department of Defense in March 1962, it entered a strategic environment shaped by the rapid institutional expansion of covert action capabilities following the Bay of Pigs failure. And to understand why uniformed planners were prepared to endorse such proposals, it is necessary to examine the operational ecosystem of Operation Mongoose, the interagency structure created under National Security Action Memorandum 124 in late 1961 to intensify pressure on the Castro regime. Mongoose brought together the CIA, the Department of Defense, and other agencies under the direction of Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, with Air Force General Edward Lansdale serving as operational coordinator, and its mission encompassed sabotage operations, propaganda broadcasts, support for exile groups, and the systematic undermining of Cuban economic and political stability. By early 1962, more than 30 discrete sabotage operations had been executed or attempted, targeting Cuban industrial infrastructure such as sugar mills, petroleum storage facilities, and transportation networks, and CIA maritime assets conducted infiltration missions from bases in Florida and Central America, illustrating that covert activity against Cuba was not hypothetical but ongoing. Within this climate, military planners faced a strategic dilemma. Covert destabilization had failed to produce regime collapse. Overt invasion lacked public justification after the Bay of Pigs embarrassment, and intelligence reporting suggested increasing Soviet material support to Havana. Therefore, the Joint Chiefs sought to create a framework that would provide legal and political grounds for intervention, and Northwoods emerged as one of several contingency studies evaluating pathways to escalate. The document's internal logic reflects an assumption that domestic opinion and international legitimacy were prerequisites for large-scale action, and that engineered incidents could bridge the gap between strategic desire and political authorization. Its proposals were organized as options rather than directives, ranging from relatively contained scenarios such as harassment at Guantanamo Bay to more elaborate deception operations involving aircraft substitution and staged communications intercepts. One particularly detailed section described the concept of chartering a civilian aircraft ostensibly carrying students or other passengers, replacing it with an unmanned drone aircraft after departure, and broadcasting a fabricated distress call before remotely destroying the drone, thereby creating the impression of a Cuban shootdown. The operational feasibility of such a plan required coordination between air traffic control authorities, intelligence fabrication units, and information management channels capable of rapidly shaping the public narrative. This was not an improvisational idea, but a structured scenario embedded in Cold War deception doctrine, drawing upon existing technological developments in unmanned aerial systems and communication spoofing. By 1962, the U.S. military had experience with remotely piloted aircraft for target practice and reconnaissance, and the substitution concept was technically conceivable within the limits of the era. Other sections proposed orchestrating incidents within U.S. territory, including staged bombings or arson attacks attributed to Cuban agents, with pre-positioned evidence designed to withstand superficial investigation. The document even referenced the possibility of arranging funerals for mock victims to amplify public outrage, underscoring the psychological dimension central to the planner's thinking. The tone of the memorandum remained administrative, emphasizing coordination requirements and plausible attribution rather than emotional rhetoric, which illustrates the institutional normalization of contingency planning during the Cold War. Within the Pentagon, drafting extreme scenarios was considered part of preparedness rather than advocacy, and documents of comparable intensity were produced regarding nuclear war plans, European reinforcement strategies, and Berlin crisis contingencies. Yet Northwoods differed in that it contemplated manipulation of American public perception as a deliberate operational tool, raising profound questions about civil-military boundaries and the ethical constraints of strategic deception. President Kennedy's rejection of the proposals must be evaluated in light of his broader approach to crisis management. Despite his aggressive rhetoric toward Cuba in public speeches, Kennedy consistently sought to calibrate escalation carefully, wary of triggering direct confrontation with the Soviet Union. And his handling of the Berlin crisis in 1961 had already demonstrated a preference for measured responses combined with controlled signaling. The White House response to Northwoods did not produce a public denunciation, but instead allowed the memorandum to recede within the classified planning archive, and the lack of implementation indicates that presidential authority functioned as a decisive constraint. General Lemnitzer, whose signature appeared on the memorandum, would later assume command of U.S. European Command, and then serve as Supreme Allied Commander Europe, positions that underscore the continuity of his career despite the episode. His advocacy for strong measures against Cuba reflected the prevailing military assessment that the island constituted a strategic vulnerability within the Western Hemisphere defense architecture. Intelligence estimates at the time assessed Cuban armed forces as expanding in both manpower and equipment, with deliveries of Soviet aircraft, tanks, and coastal defense systems documented through reconnaissance reporting, and the possibility that Cuba could serve as a forward base for Soviet power projection intensified urgency within the Pentagon. However, the absence of confirmed Soviet offensive missiles prior to October 1962 meant that the perceived threat remained primarily conventional and political, creating a gray zone in which planners believed they could act before the balance shifted irreversibly. The Northwoods document thus illuminates the intersection between intelligence assessment and strategic imagination, revealing how threat perception can expand the scope of considered options within bureaucratic planning processes. It also demonstrates the compartmentalized nature of Cold War governance, where a small circle of senior officials could evaluate proposals of extraordinary consequence without broader institutional awareness. The memorandum did not circulate through Congress, nor was it subjected to judicial scrutiny, reflecting the concentration of national security authority within the executive branch during periods of perceived crisis. The later declassification of the document in the 1990s provided historians with rare insight into the internal deliberations of early 1962, allowing comparison between proposed actions and those actually taken during the Cuban Missile Crisis. During that later confrontation, Kennedy rejected airstrikes and invasion in favor of a naval quarantine, a decision consistent with his earlier refusal to authorize Northwoods. The contrast between these two episodes suggests a pattern of civilian restraint amid military advocacy for decisive action, though it must be noted that the Joint Chiefs' role was to present options rather than determine policy. Operation Northwoods therefore functions as a window into the mechanics of Cold War contingency development, illustrating how institutions prepared for scenarios that never materialized, yet influenced the strategic discourse of their time. By examining the operational details embedded within the memorandum, including the integration of psychological operations, deception planning, and logistical feasibility, one gains a deeper understanding of how the Cold War blurred distinctions between overt and covert instruments of power. As 1962 progressed toward the missile crisis, the strategic calculus would shift dramatically, but in the spring of that year, Northwoods represented a crystallization of the frustration and urgency felt within the defense establishment, encapsulating a moment when the perceived necessity of confronting Cuba collided with the constitutional authority of the presidency and the broader implications of manufacturing justification for war. The strategic environment in which Operation Northwoods was conceived cannot be separated from the institutional shock produced by the failure of the Bay of Pigs invasion in April 1961, an operation that exposed deficiencies in interagency coordination, overconfidence in exile capabilities, and flawed intelligence assumptions regarding the likelihood of an internal Cuban uprising. In the aftermath of that failure, President Kennedy authorized an aggressive expansion of covert pressure through Operation Mongoose, but he simultaneously sought tighter White House oversight of planning processes that might entangle the United States in uncontrolled escalation. This dual approach created structural tension between the civilian leadership's caution and the military establishment's determination to restore credibility through decisive measures. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, responsible for contingency war planning across multiple theaters, including Europe, Korea, and the Western Hemisphere, operated within a doctrine emphasizing readiness to exploit opportunity and respond rapidly to perceived threats, and their endorsement of Northwoods must be understood within that doctrinal framework rather than as an isolated aberration. By early 1962, the Chiefs viewed Cuba not merely as a hostile regime, but as a strategic node with potential to disrupt hemispheric defense arrangements, undermine alliance confidence, and serve as a psychological victory for the Soviet Union. Intelligence reporting indicated that Cuban armed forces numbered over 200,000 personnel, including militia formations, supported by Soviet-supplied MiG aircraft and coastal artillery systems. And these developments were interpreted as indicators of long-term consolidation rather than temporary instability. Within this context, Northwoods represented an attempt to engineer strategic initiative by shifting the political narrative, thereby unlocking authorization for overt military intervention that had thus far remained politically constrained. The memorandum's operational concepts reveal a layered understanding of information warfare long before the term became commonplace, proposing synchronized incidents, evidence fabrication, and media management as integral components of the plan. In one scenario, false casualty lists would be prepared in advance, and public ceremonies would amplify the emotional impact of the staged event, demonstrating that planners considered not only tactical feasibility, but also the orchestration of public perception. The emphasis on Guantanamo Bay reflected both its symbolic resonance and its operational convenience, as the base offered a controlled environment where limited incidents could be staged with manageable risk. Proposals included fomenting riots, staging sabotage within the perimeter, and attributing mortar attacks to Cuban forces, all designed to create a casus belli under the framework of self-defense. These proposals were drafted in language consistent with other contingency documents of the era, referencing logistics, timelines, and interagency coordination rather than ideological justification, underscoring the bureaucratic normalization of scenario planning during the Cold War. Yet despite the institutional endorsement of the Joint Chiefs, the decision-making chain remained firmly anchored in presidential authority, and the Kennedy administration's refusal to authorize Northwoods demonstrates the decisive role of civilian control over the military. Kennedy's strategic calculus in 1962 was influenced not only by Cuba, but also by broader geopolitical considerations, including Berlin, NATO cohesion, and the emerging nuclear balance. Initiating an overt invasion of Cuba under manufactured pretenses risked undermining U.S. credibility internationally, particularly among non-aligned states whose support Washington sought to cultivate. Moreover, Kennedy and his advisors were acutely aware that escalation in Cuba could trigger Soviet countermoves elsewhere, potentially in Berlin, where tensions remained high following the construction of the Berlin Wall in August 1961. Thus, the rejection of Northwoods can be interpreted as part of a broader effort to manage risk across multiple theaters, rather than a narrow moral judgment confined to the Cuban context. The document's survival within classified archives until its eventual declassification decades later reveals how contingency planning often remains invisible to public awareness, shaping strategic options without necessarily translating into policy. The release of Northwoods in the 1990s provided historians with concrete evidence of the extreme measures contemplated during moments of Cold War anxiety, challenging simplified narratives of linear decision-making. It also highlights the complexity of attributing responsibility within bureaucratic systems, as the memorandum was produced through staff processes and endorsed collectively by the Joint Chiefs. Yet, ultimate accountability rested with elected leadership. The institutional culture of the early 1960s valued comprehensive preparedness, and planners frequently drafted scenarios that extended beyond what political leaders were willing to authorize. Similar patterns can be observed in nuclear war planning documents, such as the Single Integrated Operational Plan, which outlined massive retaliatory strikes that presidents later sought to refine or constrain. Northwoods therefore fits within a broader pattern of Cold War contingency exploration, reflecting an environment in which worst-case thinking dominated strategic discourse. At the same time, the episode underscores the importance of archival transparency in reconstructing historical decision-making, as the document's eventual release enabled critical examination of the gap between planning and execution. The broader implications of Northwoods lie not in what occurred, but in what was considered plausible within institutional frameworks. It reveals that during periods of acute geopolitical stress, the boundaries of acceptable policy proposals can expand significantly, constrained ultimately by leadership judgment and political calculation. As 1962 moved toward the confrontation of October, the United States and the Soviet Union would engage in direct negotiation under the shadow of nuclear war, and Kennedy's management of that crisis would further demonstrate his preference for controlled escalation over precipitous action. In retrospect, Northwoods stands as a stark illustration of the range of options that surfaced within the Cold War security apparatus, illuminating how strategic urgency, institutional momentum, and political oversight interacted behind closed doors during one of the most volatile years of the 20th century. As the summer of 1962 unfolded, the internal deliberations surrounding Cuba intensified rather than diminished, and although Operation Northwoods had been set aside, the structural forces that produced it remained active within the national security apparatus. Operation Mongoose continued to execute sabotage missions, infiltration efforts, and psychological operations designed to destabilize the Castro regime. And intelligence reporting increasingly indicated that Soviet military shipments to Cuba were expanding in scale and sophistication. Reconnaissance flights and human intelligence sources documented the arrival of additional MiG fighter aircraft, radar installations, and surface-to-air missile components, developments that suggested a shift from purely political alignment to hardened military integration. Within the Pentagon, planners interpreted these indicators as evidence that time favored the consolidation of Cuban defensive capabilities, and contingency discussions therefore remained oriented toward identifying leverage points that could justify decisive action before the balance shifted irreversibly. Although Northwoods had not been approved, its conceptual framework reflected an underlying anxiety regarding strategic credibility, and that anxiety did not dissipate with its rejection. The Joint Chiefs maintained pressure for options that would enable overt intervention, while the White House continued to insist upon calibrated escalation, producing a dynamic in which covert actions expanded, but overt invasion remained politically constrained. This tension reveals a core feature of Cold War decision-making: the coexistence of aggressive contingency planning with presidential restraint shaped by global risk calculations. By August 1962, intelligence analysts within the Central Intelligence Agency began reporting unusual patterns in Soviet shipping to Cuba, including the presence of large crates and covered equipment inconsistent with previously observed defensive systems. And although the full implications were not yet clear, the atmosphere within Washington grew increasingly vigilant. The institutional memory of Northwoods illustrates how strategic imagination can outpace policy authorization, yet it also underscores how executive oversight can narrow the operational field, even amid escalating threat perception. Kennedy's approach to Cuba was shaped by lessons drawn from the Bay of Pigs, where insufficient scrutiny of assumptions had led to strategic embarrassment. He sought to avoid both passivity and overreaction, aware that domestic political pressure to appear firm could clash with the catastrophic consequences of direct superpower confrontation. The rejection of Northwoods must therefore be interpreted not as a singular moral repudiation, but as part of a broader pattern of measured escalation management. The document itself, once declassified, revealed the extent to which Cold War planners were prepared to manipulate informational environments, and it has since served as a case study in the ethics of deception within democratic systems. Yet it is essential to distinguish between planning and implementation. The existence of a contingency proposal does not equate to its execution, and the archival record demonstrates that Northwoods remained confined to the planning stage. As October 1962 approached, and U-2 reconnaissance flights confirmed the presence of Soviet medium-range ballistic missile sites under construction in Cuba, the strategic calculus shifted dramatically. The discovery of nuclear-capable missiles 90 miles from Florida introduced a new dimension of urgency that eclipsed earlier contingency concepts. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy convened the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, fostering a deliberative process that evaluated airstrikes, invasion, and blockade options, and ultimately selecting a naval quarantine combined with back-channel negotiation. This crisis Management approach contrasted sharply with the aggressive posture embodied in Northwoods, illustrating the evolution of decision-making under direct nuclear threat. The juxtaposition of these episodes highlights the variability within Cold War governance. Institutions capable of drafting extreme scenarios were also capable of exercising restraint under existential pressure. In examining Northwoods within the broader trajectory of 1962, one observes that strategic fear can generate expansive contingency planning, but the translation of those plans into policy depends upon the interplay between military advice, civilian leadership, intelligence assessment, and international context. The Cold War environment incentivized worst-case thinking, yet it also required leaders to calibrate actions carefully to avoid unintended escalation. Northwoods remains a vivid example of how those competing imperatives collided behind closed doors during one of the most volatile periods of the 20th century. The declassification of Operation Northwoods in the 1990s fundamentally altered historical understanding of early 1960s U.S. strategic planning, not because it revealed an executed conspiracy, but because it provided documentary evidence of the spectrum of actions formally considered within the highest levels of the defense establishment during a period of acute geopolitical stress. The memorandum emerged from archives associated with the investigation into President Kennedy's assassination, released under the President John F. Kennedy Assassination Records Collection Act, and its authenticity was confirmed by its inclusion within Department of Defense files bearing official routing stamps and signatures, including that of Chairman of the Joint Chiefs General Lyman Lemnitzer. The document's language is clinical, structured, and devoid of rhetorical flourish, a characteristic that underscores its origin as bureaucratic planning rather than speculative commentary. It enumerates proposed scenarios, outlines intended effects on public opinion, and references interagency coordination requirements, reflecting a methodical approach to contingency design. For scholars of civil-military relations, Northwoods provides insight into the internal mechanics of Cold War planning culture, where the drafting of extreme options was normalized within classified environments. The chief's endorsement did not imply unanimous ideological fervor, but rather adherence to a doctrinal responsibility to present what they considered feasible means to achieve stated policy objectives. Their institutional mandate required preparing for intervention against perceived threats, and Cuba, following the Bay of Pigs and ongoing Operation Mongoose sabotage efforts, remained at the forefront of Western Hemisphere security concerns. The memorandum's proposals must therefore be situated within the broader spectrum of Cold War deception doctrines, which included psychological operations, covert sabotage, and information manipulation directed abroad. What distinguished Northwoods was the contemplation of staging incidents on or near U.S. territory as a catalyst for overt war, introducing domestic perception management into the operational calculus. This dimension highlights the thin boundary between external deception and internal political engineering during periods of heightened strategic anxiety. The Kennedy administration's rejection of the plan underscores the constitutional framework of civilian supremacy over military advice, reaffirming that contingency drafts did not automatically translate into execution. In fact, Kennedy's broader approach to Cuba throughout 1962 reflected a consistent pattern of resisting pressures for immediate invasion in favor of incremental measures. After the Cuban Missile Crisis in October, which brought the United States and the Soviet Union to the brink of nuclear exchange, the administration shifted toward crisis, stabilization, and arms control discussions, including the eventual negotiation of the Limited Test Ban Treaty in 1963. In this post-crisis environment, proposals such as Northwoods appeared even more destabilizing in retrospect, reinforcing the perception that measured restraint had prevented catastrophic escalation. Yet it would be overly simplistic to characterize Northwoods as an aberration divorced from its context. Rather, it emerged from a policy ecosystem in which intelligence assessments, alliance credibility, domestic political pressures, and superpower rivalry interacted dynamically. The chief's perception that Cuban alignment with Moscow threatened hemispheric balance was rooted in intelligence data indicating expanding Soviet military shipments and training missions, and their willingness to consider unconventional justifications reflected the urgency they attributed to the situation. At the same time, the absence of broader interagency endorsement suggests that Northwoods did not represent a unified consensus across the national security apparatus. The State Department's diplomatic perspective, the CIA's ongoing covert sabotage operations, and the White House's political calculations each exerted countervailing influence. The document's existence therefore illustrates not only the extremes contemplated within military planning circles, but also the filtering mechanisms inherent in executive decision-making. Historiographically, Northwoods has been invoked in debates over transparency, conspiracy theory, and institutional trust, sometimes detached from its documented status as an unimplemented contingency. Careful analysis requires distinguishing between archival fact and extrapolation, recognizing that the Cold War produced numerous contingency plans that were never activated. The significance of Northwoods lies in what it reveals about the boundaries of consideration within a democratic system under strategic strain. It demonstrates that during moments of perceived existential threat, proposals that would otherwise appear unthinkable can enter formal, deliberative channels. That they did not proceed reflects the decisive role of leadership in constraining bureaucratic momentum. By examining the document alongside contemporaneous records from Operation Mongoose, Joint Chiefs Minutes, and National Security Council memoranda, one observes a pattern of iterative planning in which aggressive options were generated, debated, and often set aside in favor of calibrated alternatives. Operation Northwoods thus occupies a distinct position in Cold War history, not as an executed deception, but as a documentary artifact of the intense strategic pressures shaping early 1962, illuminating how closed-door deliberations grappled with the perceived necessity of confronting Cuba while navigating the risks inherent in superpower rivalry. To fully grasp what Operation Northwoods reveals about Cold War decision-making, it is essential to examine the structural incentives embedded within the national security system of the early 1960s, where institutional roles, threat assessments, and bureaucratic mandates shaped the spectrum of options presented to civilian leadership. The Joint Chiefs of Staff operated within a doctrine that prioritized readiness, deterrence credibility, and strategic initiative, and their institutional culture emphasized anticipating worst-case scenarios rather than assuming adversary restraint. In this environment, contingency plans were not expressions of political intent, but instruments of preparedness, and the drafting of extreme options functioned as a means of expanding the decision space available to policymakers. The chief's endorsement of Northwoods therefore reflects a mindset in which the perceived strategic danger posed by Cuba justified exploring unconventional pathways to intervention, particularly after the embarrassment of the Bay of Pigs had damaged American prestige. Intelligence reporting in early 1962 described Cuban military mobilization, Soviet advisory presence, and expanding defensive infrastructure, reinforcing the belief among defense planners that delay could entrench a hostile regime within the Western Hemisphere. Yet civilian leadership assessed the situation through a broader lens that incorporated alliance politics, international law, and the nuclear balance with the Soviet Union. Kennedy's refusal to authorize Northwoods underscores the friction inherent in this division of perspectives. Military planners focused on operational feasibility and strategic advantage, while the president evaluated political legitimacy and escalation risk. The episode therefore illuminates the checks and balances embedded within Cold War governance, demonstrating that even under intense geopolitical stress, the constitutional structure of civilian control constrained the translation of contingency planning into policy. It also reveals the compartmentalization characteristic of the era. The memorandum circulated within a restricted chain of command, limiting exposure and preventing broader institutional debate. This concentration of deliberation within small executive circles reflects the secrecy norms governing national security during the Cold War, where classification protocols were justified by the need to protect operational integrity and intelligence sources. The later declassification of Northwoods allowed historians to reconstruct these internal dynamics, situating the memorandum within a broader archive of Cold War planning documents that include nuclear targeting plans, Berlin crisis contingencies, and covert sabotage directives. Comparatively, Northwoods occupies a distinctive position because it explicitly addressed the manipulation of public perception as a strategic instrument, blurring the boundary between external deception and domestic political engineering. The fact that it remained unimplemented highlights the decisive filtering function of presidential authority, yet its existence demonstrates how far institutional imagination could extend under perceived threat. As the Cuban Missile Crisis, later in 1962, brought the superpowers to the brink of nuclear exchange, Kennedy's crisis management approach emphasized deliberation, controlled signaling, and back-channel diplomacy, contrasting with the aggressive posture embedded in Northwoods. This contrast reinforces the argument that Cold War decision-making was not monolithic, but contingent upon leadership judgment and evolving intelligence. Operation Northwoods, viewed in retrospect, serves as a window into the strategic anxieties of early 1962, capturing a moment when the desire to reassert initiative collided with the constitutional limits of executive power. Its legacy lies not in actions taken, but in the insight it provides into how democratic institutions grapple with extreme options during periods of perceived existential risk, revealing both the expansiveness of contingency planning and the constraints imposed by civilian oversight within the American system. Operation Northwoods endures in the historical record not because it was carried out, but because it exposes with unusual clarity the architecture of Cold War contingency planning, at a moment when strategic anxiety, institutional momentum, and geopolitical rivalry converged behind closed doors in Washington. The memorandum's significance lies in its documentation of how the national security bureaucracy translated perceived threat into operational options, even when those options contemplated manipulation of public perception and staged incidents designed to generate political authorization for war. In early 1962, the United States confronted a Cuba that had survived the Bay of Pigs, consolidated internal control, and aligned increasingly with the Soviet Union. And within that environment, defense planners assessed that time favored Havana's entrenchment. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, operating within a mandate to prepare for decisive action, endorsed proposals that would create a pretext for intervention by attributing engineered incidents to Cuban aggression. The language of the document reveals no improvisation. It reflects structured thinking, logistics coordination, and information management considerations characteristic of formal planning processes. Yet the memorandum also illustrates the critical boundary between drafting and executing policy. President Kennedy's rejection reaffirmed civilian supremacy and demonstrated that contingency proposals, however extreme, required executive approval to move beyond the planning stage. The broader trajectory of 1962 underscores this restraint. As intelligence uncovered Soviet missile deployments in Cuba later that year, the administration navigated a direct superpower confrontation through blockade and negotiation, rather than immediate airstrikes or invasion, reinforcing a pattern of calibrated escalation. In this sense, Northwoods highlights the tension between military advocacy for strategic initiative and presidential caution shaped by global risk assessment. Its later declassification, decades after the Cold War ended, provided scholars with rare visibility into the deliberative processes of the era, revealing that within classified environments, institutions could explore extraordinary measures while still remaining subject to constitutional constraint. Operation Northwoods therefore reveals more about the dynamics of Cold War governance than about clandestine execution. It demonstrates how perceived existential threats can expand the range of considered options, how bureaucratic systems generate scenarios designed to preserve strategic credibility, and how ultimate authority rests with elected leadership capable of rejecting those scenarios. The document stands as a testament to the intensity of early 1960s strategic fear, but also as evidence of the structural safeguards embedded within the American political system that prevented the translation of such proposals into action. In examining Northwoods within the broader context of Operation Mongoose, the Bay of Pigs aftermath, and the Cuban Missile Crisis, one observes a continuum of pressure and restraint, ambition and caution, secrecy and oversight. The plan to stage attacks and attribute them to Cuba was drafted, endorsed at high military levels, and then set aside, leaving behind a paper trail that illuminates the internal logic of Cold War crisis preparation. Its legacy is not a manufactured war, but a documented insight into how far institutions were willing to contemplate going in defense of strategic objectives, and how the interplay between military planning and civilian decision-making ultimately determined the boundaries of action during one of the most volatile periods in modern history.